In 1964, Chrysler showed up to Daytona with an engine nobody had seen before. They finished first, second, third, fourth, and fifth. NASCAR banned it after one season, so Chrysler pointed it at the drag strip instead. Then the sanctioning bodies tried to contain it there too. This is the story of the 426 Hemi, the engine that got outlawed twice, outsmarted two of the largest corporations in America, and built a legacy that is still selling cars today. To understand why the Hemi mattered, you have to understand what the American automobile industry looked like in the early 1960s. It was a war, not a polite competition. An actual war, fought on racetracks every weekend, with billions of dollars and millions of car sales riding on the outcome. The slogan was simple: race on Sunday, sell on Monday. If your car won on the track this weekend, showrooms would be full by Tuesday. And it worked. It absolutely worked. Young Americans in the early 60s were buying cars the way people buy phones today, constantly, competitively, with a lot of attention paid to what was fastest. Ford understood this. General Motors understood this. And Chrysler, the smallest of the big three, perpetually running a little short on cash and a little long on ambition, understood it better than anyone. The 1950s had established a kind of pecking order. Chevrolet had the small block V8, light and versatile and capable of going fast in the right hands. Ford had its own performance lineup, constantly revised. Chrysler had actually run a hemispherical engine in the early 1950s, one that made waves and earned serious respect, then discontinued it in 1958 because it was expensive to build and the company needed to cut costs. That decision would haunt them. They replaced it with the B-Series wedge engines, competent, cheaper to build. Not exactly legendary. The Max wedge engines that came in 1962 were genuine race weapons, generating up to 421 horsepower and terrorizing drag strips across the country. But they had limits. The engineers at Chrysler knew they had limits, and they already had ideas about what came next. Meanwhile, Ford was pouring serious money into performance. The Ford Total Performance Program, launched in 1962, was a coordinated, well-funded assault on every form of motorsport simultaneously: NASCAR, Le Mans, drag racing. They had the resources and the organizational commitment to back it up. General Motors had officially pulled out of racing in 1957 following an industry gentleman's agreement. Unofficially, parts and engineering support kept flowing to teams. The Chevrolet Mystery engine showed up at Daytona in 1963 and immediately blew everyone's doors off. Then GM pulled it before the season started because officially they weren't racing. The engine just vanished. So heading into 1964, Ford was the dominant force in NASCAR. Chrysler was competitive, but not consistently winning. And someone in Chrysler's engineering department decided enough was enough. They started working on something new, secretly. And when they showed up at Daytona that February, nobody was ready for what they brought. The engineering problem Chrysler needed to solve wasn't simply make more power. Any manufacturer can make more power by making an engine bigger. That's not engineering. That's just addition. The real problem was efficiency. How do you extract maximum power from a given volume of air and fuel? Because that's ultimately what an internal combustion engine is, an air pump. You push air and fuel in, ignite it, extract energy from the expansion. The more efficiently you do that, the more power you get. In the early 1960s, this was a problem nobody had fully solved for a production-based racing engine. The standard wedge-shaped combustion chamber, what most V8s used at the time, was simple and cheap to manufacture, but it came with compromises. The spark plug sat off to the side of the chamber. The flame front had to travel across the entire chamber to ignite the full mixture. That takes time. In an engine turning over 6,000 revolutions per minute, time is exactly what you don't have. Chrysler's engineers, led by a man named Tom Hoover, who would become known as the father of the Hemi, went back to a concept that had been around since the 1920s, the hemispherical combustion chamber. The idea was elegant in its geometry. Instead of a flat or wedge-shaped space, you use a dome, a hemisphere. The spark plug sits at the center of the dome. The flame front propagates outward in all directions simultaneously, like a stone dropped in still water. Everything burns at once, no flame travel time. Complete, even combustion. And because the chamber is dome-shaped, you can fit larger valves, much larger. The intake and exhaust valves sit on opposite sides of the dome, angled away from each other. This produces a crossflow head design, where intake and exhaust move through the engine in a straight line rather than doubling back on themselves. The result is better breathing, more air in, more exhaust out, faster. At high RPM, this matters enormously. The downside was cost. The geometry is complex. The valve train requires rocker arms and push rods arranged in ways that add parts, add weight, add manufacturing time. A hemispherical head cost significantly more to produce than a wedge head. Chrysler built it anyway, and they did it in secret, because if Ford and GM knew what was coming, they might have actually prepared for it. They didn't get the chance. The 426 Hemi was born in 1963. Chrysler's engineering team, Hoover, alongside Willem Weertman, and a group of engineers who rarely get adequate credit, spent months developing and testing behind closed doors at the Chelsea Proving Grounds in Michigan. The project had an internal name, the Race Hemi. Nobody was pretending this was for street driving. This was a weapon built for one purpose. The first time most of the racing world heard about it was February 23, 1964. The Daytona 500. Richard Petty won. Jimmy Pardue came in second. Paul Goldsmith third. Leroy Yarbrough fourth. Bobby Isaac fifth. All of them driving Chrysler products. All of them running the 426 Hemi, Ford's finest, the Holman Moody. Prepared cars that had been dominant the previous season finished somewhere behind them, not close behind, just behind. The margin of victory wasn't the story, the ease was. Chrysler didn't just win at Daytona, they made it look like the other teams were in a different event. Bill France Sr., who ran NASCAR, was not pleased. He was trying to operate a competitive series, which meant keeping manufacturers engaged. If one company arrived with something so dominant that everyone else had no realistic chance, the other manufacturers would leave. And if they left, France had a problem. France had a rule that might help him. Cars had to be based on production vehicles, and engines had to be available to the public. The 426 Race Hemi existed only in Chrysler's racing program. It wasn't in any production car. Technically, arguably, it was ineligible. Chrysler argued back. Ford pressured France hard, because Ford was not going to quietly accept this. Negotiations ground on through the year, and heading into the 1965 NASCAR season, France banned the Hemi. Chrysler's response was immediate. They boycotted the 1965 NASCAR season entirely. No Chrysler, no Dodge, no Plymouth. Gone. This caused its own problems for France. Richard Petty, by then a genuine fan favorite, sat out the season. Attendance at races dropped. The series ran, but it ran without the marquee names that drew the biggest crowds. France had made his point. It cost him. The two sides eventually negotiated a resolution. Chrysler would develop a street version of the Hemi, making it an actual production engine available to the public in exchange for reinstatement in 1966. France agreed. The deal was done. So Chrysler went and built the street Hemi. And this is where something interesting happened. The engineers tasked with creating a street version of a pure race engine didn't detune it into mediocrity. They made genuine compromises: lower compression ratio for pump gasoline, a less aggressive camshaft profile, cast iron instead of aluminum to reduce cost. But the fundamental architecture was untouched. The hemispherical combustion chambers, the large valves, the crossflow heads, all of it in a car you could drive off a dealer's lot. The official power rating was 425 horsepower, almost certainly understated. Insurance costs, homologation strategy, and no standardized testing method all played into it. Independent dyno operators of the era consistently showed numbers well above the official figure. Some testing suggested the street Hemi was closer to 500 horsepower in stock form. Chrysler never confirmed this. They just kept selling them. The first production cars to receive the street Hemi in 1966 were the Dodge Charger and the Plymouth Satellite. The engine listed at around $800 as an option. In today's money, roughly $8,000. Buyers lined up. Meanwhile, at the drag strip, the race Hemi was running into its own bureaucratic complications. The National Hot Rod Association had eligibility rules of its own. The Hemi had been competing in various classes, but pure race versions were being challenged on the same grounds France had used. Was this a legitimate production-based engine, or a purpose-built race unit wearing a thin disguise? Chrysler's answer was the same answer they'd given NASCAR. Fine, we'll sell it to the public. And in 1965 and 66, they did exactly that. Not just the street Hemi in regular passenger cars, but purpose-built race packages. The A990 program. Super stock cars built on Chrysler's own production lines, destined for drag racing. These weren't modified street cars. They were factory race cars built on assembly lines, interiors stripped out, bodies acid-dipped to reduce weight, aluminum front panels replacing steel, a race-prepared Hemi where a normal engine would sit. You could technically buy one at a dealership. Most went straight to a racetrack. Ford's response to all of this was ambitious and ultimately frustrated. Ford had its own serious engine, the 427 cubic inch FE big block, that was genuinely competitive. But they could see the Hemi eating their lunch simultaneously in NASCAR and drag racing, so they built a response. The 427 single overhead cam engine, immediately nicknamed the Cammer. The Cammer used a single overhead camshaft on each cylinder bank, allowing it to rev higher and breathe better. In testing, it produced somewhere around 650 horsepower in race trim. NASCAR banned it before it ever raced. In drag racing, the NHRA allowed the Cammer in limited competition, but it never achieved the dominance Ford had hoped for. Development problems, high cost. And Chrysler kept winning anyway. By the late 1960s, the 426 Hemi had become the engine. Not one of the fast engines, the engine. What you bought if you were serious about the quarter mile, and also serious about spending significant money and unconcerned about fuel consumption. The cars wearing it became cultural objects. The 1968 Dodge Charger, the 1969 Plymouth Roadrunner, the 1970 Plymouth Barracuda, the 1970 Dodge Challenger RT. They appeared in films. They appeared in the news, usually in connection with something going very fast in a direction it probably shouldn't have been going. The muscle car era peaked somewhere around 1969 and 1970. The Hemi sat at the top of that peak like it owned the place. For a few years, it did. If you're enjoying this, hit subscribe. We cover stuff like this every week. Engines, aircraft, military tech, anything with a genuinely interesting engineering story behind it. Okay? Let's talk about how this thing actually made its power. The 426, 426 cubic inches of displacement, 6.98 liters in modern terms. Not the largest engine around at the time. Ford ran a 427, Chevrolet offered a 454, Cadillac had a 500 cubic inch unit that nobody put in race cars for obvious reasons. But displacement was never the whole story with the Hemi. Start with the combustion chamber. A hemispherical chamber is shaped like the inside of a half sphere. The piston dome and the cylinder head together form this shape when the piston reaches the top of its stroke. The spark plug sits at the center of the dome. When it fires, the flame front expands outward in every direction simultaneously, like dropping a stone in water and watching the rings expand in a perfect circle. That simultaneous, uniform burn means more of the fuel charge converts to useful work. In a wedge chamber, the flame travels from one side to the other. You get uneven combustion, energy that becomes heat rather than pressure on the piston. With the hemisphere, you minimize all of that. Everything burns. Everything pushes down at the same time. The result is higher thermal efficiency, more work extracted from the same amount of fuel. Now, the valves. The 426 Hemi ran intake valves at 2.25 inches in diameter, exhaust valves at 1.94 inches. These are large. A contemporary Chevrolet big block in performance configuration used intake valves around 2.1 inches. The difference sounds small. It isn't. Valve size determines how much air and fuel mixture can flow into a cylinder and how quickly exhaust gases can exit. At 6,000 revolutions per minute, an engine is trying to fill and empty its cylinders 100 times per second per cylinder. Every restriction in the airflow path costs power. Bigger valves mean less restriction. Less restriction means more power where it counts. At the high RPM end of the range, exactly where race engines live, the valves sat on opposite sides of the hemispherical chamber, angled approximately 58 degrees apart from each other. This is the crossflow arrangement. Intake enters from one side, exhaust exits from the other. The mixture doesn't navigate around obstacles or fold back on itself. Straight path in, straight path out. The valve train required to operate this geometry was mechanically complex. Each valve needed its own rocker arm arranged to accommodate the angled valve stems. The result was a notably wide cylinder head. This produced one of the engine's nicknames, the elephant motor. Those wide rocker covers on either side. Big ears. The cylinder block was built to match. Cast iron, thick-walled, with 4-bolt main bearing caps on the center, 3 journals. 4-bolt mains mean the crankshaft is secured at each bearing location by 4 bolts rather than 2. This adds rigidity and allows the engine to handle the kind of loads that would distort a lesser block. Important for a street engine. Critical for a race engine living in a state of constant extreme stress. The street Hemi ran a compression ratio of 10.25 to 1. Moderately high for a street engine of that era. Premium fuel was required. Race versions pushed to 12.5 to 1, demanding specialized fuel blends that weren't available at ordinary filling stations. Official output, 425 horsepower at 5,000 RPM. 490 pound-feet of torque at 4,100 revolutions per minute. That torque figure is the one to focus on. Torque is what moves a car from a standing start. Power is what keeps it moving at high speed. The Hemi made both in quantities that nothing else on the street could match simultaneously. The dual 4-barrel carburetor setup contributed substantially. 2 Carter AFB carburetors, each feeding one bank of 4 cylinders. Under normal driving, the front carburetor handled everything. Press the throttle hard, and the rear carburetor opened, dumping additional fuel and air into the engine with an abruptness that new drivers either learned to manage or didn't. The engine was also available with a single 4-barrel for slightly less drama, but buyers who were serious took the dual setup. The exhaust manifolds deserve their own mention. Cast iron, designed to minimize flow restriction, with large outlet ports that match the engine's breathing capacity. The sound this produced was distinctive enough that enthusiasts could identify a Hemi by ear from a significant distance, deep and lumpy at idle. At full throttle, something between a roar and a crack that had no real equivalent in other American iron of the era. Now, the race version. For the NHRA Superstock and Pro Stock classes, Chrysler offered increasingly specialized configurations throughout the late 1960s. Aluminum cylinder heads instead of cast iron, saving meaningful weight at the top of the engine. Cross-ram intake manifolds that mounted the carburetors sideways, allowing a longer intake runner for improved torque at high RPM. Solid lifter camshaft profiles that produced power curves ideal for the quarter mile while making the cars nearly undrivable in ordinary traffic. The quarter mile is the drag racer's standard distance, dead stop, 440 yards. Whoever crosses the finish line first. Simple, decisive. A 426 Hemi in full race tune in a factory-built superstock car could cover that distance in around 10 seconds in 1967, at around 135 miles per hour at the finish line. For context, a contemporary street performance car, a Mustang 390 GT, a Chevrolet Chevelle SS 396, would run the quarter in somewhere around 14 to 15 seconds. The race Hemi wasn't a little faster, it was 40% faster. That's not a performance advantage. That's a different category of vehicle wearing a car-shaped disguise. Ford eventually developed competitive answers. The Cobra Jet 398, then the 428 Super Cobra Jet, were serious engines and packages that actually handled better than most Chrysler products of the era. The Chevrolet LS6 454 was a legitimate rival in brute torque. The Z/L1 Camaro with its all-aluminum 427 was arguably the most fearsome straight-line weapon of the entire era. Though Chevrolet built so few of them, they were more of a statement than a market force. None of them dismantled the Hemi's position. The NHRA record books in Superstock and Pro Stock through the late 1960s read like Chrysler marketing material. By 1969, the race Hemi had evolved to a point where the NHRA was moving the cars into increasingly restrictive classes just to keep competition meaningful. They were too fast for the categories they'd been built for, so the categories were reclassified around them. Chrysler kept winning. The technical footnote that doesn't get discussed enough, the Hemi's advantage wasn't one thing. It was everything working together. Large chamber volume allowed larger valves. Larger valves enabled better airflow. Better airflow fed a complete and efficient burn. Complete burn produced more pressure per cycle. More pressure pushed harder on the piston. Every element reinforced every other element. Tom Hoover understood this from the beginning. The design wasn't a collection of good ideas assembled in proximity. It was a system. Each component existed in relationship to every other component. You couldn't transplant the Hemi's combustion chamber onto a different engine and expect equivalent results. The whole point was the whole. The muscle car era ended in 1971, not gradually, quickly. The causes were multiple and converging. Insurance companies had noticed that young men with powerful cars were getting into expensive accidents and priced coverage nearly out of reach for that demographic. Federal emissions regulations were coming, and high-compression engines weren't surviving them without major rework. The oil embargo of 1973 made fuel consumption urgent. Manufacturers had already begun reducing compression ratios and detoxifying their engines before the regulations formally arrived. Chrysler discontinued the street Hemi after the 1971 model year. The 426 had been offered for 6 model years. Total production across all variants was somewhere around 11,000 units. That's not many. A moderately popular sedan today sells more units in a single week. The rarity accelerated the legend. Cars with documented Hemi provenance became collector's items within a few years of production ending. By the 1980s, a genuine Hemi car in good condition was worth multiples of its original purchase price. By the 90s, serious money. Today, an authenticated numbers-matching 1970 Plymouth Barracuda with a 426 Hemi will sell for $500,000 at a major auction. The right configuration will go higher. Ford's Mustang survived into the new era, shrunken and depowered. The performance engines were retired. The car that had defined a generation became a fuel economy exercise. Chevrolet spent most of the 1970s selling Camaros with engines that wouldn't have intimidated a school bus. But something else was happening, slower and less visible. The Hemi had established something that couldn't be taken back. It had proven, with actual race results and actual performance data, that hemispherical combustion chamber technology extracted more power more reliably than competing designs. That's not an opinion or a marketing claim. That's a measurable outcome, verified over years of competition. The entire engine industry took notes. Modern engine design, multi-valve systems, pent-roof combustion chambers, direct injection positioned at the center of the chamber, traces a direct line back to the principles Tom Hoover and his team applied in 1963. The implementation evolved. The combustion physics didn't. The NASCAR situation had its own lasting consequences. When France banned the Hemi and Chrysler boycotted the series, it established something important. Manufacturers had genuine leverage. They weren't just vehicle suppliers, they were the reason people watched. The lesson was absorbed. Less unilateral rule-making afterward, more negotiation. The drag racing legacy was more immediate. Chrysler's dominance directly shaped how the NHRA structured classes and wrote rules for decades. The technology filtered into the aftermarket, parts, knowledge, techniques, all of it available to anyone willing to learn. Machine shops opened. An entire ecosystem of Hemi expertise grew up around the racing program. That ecosystem still exists. Builders who have spent 40 years working on nothing else, suppliers producing new components, some better than the originals, for an engine architecture over 60 years old. In 2003, Chrysler, by then operating under the Daimler-Chrysler banner, introduced a new Hemi, the 5.7-liter Hemi V8. It used the hemispherical combustion chamber concept, and it was intended to power a new generation of Dodge and Ram products while recapturing something of what the original had represented. The enthusiast community was cautiously skeptical. The Hemi name had been applied before, in the 1970s, to engines that weren't really Hemis in the meaningful sense. Was this genuine or marketing? The answer was genuinely an improvement on what had come before, with modern constraints honestly acknowledged. Emissions and fuel economy requirements meant it had to compromise in ways the 1964 race engine never did. But the combustion principles were real. The 5.7 made between 345 and 370 horsepower, depending on application. A 6.1-liter version for performance applications made 425 horsepower. 425. The same official number as the original street Hemi. Whether coincidence or a deliberate callback, no one at Chrysler ever officially confirmed. The people who knew the history noticed. The modern Hemi kept evolving. 707 horsepower in the Dodge Challenger SRT Hellcat. 797 in the Redeye. 840 in the Demon, and then over 1,000 horsepower in the Challenger SRT Demon 170, running on E85 ethanol fuel. The Demon 170 ran the quarter mile in under 9 seconds, at over 150 miles per hour, in a car with air conditioning and back seats. The race Hemis of 1967 ran the quarter in 10 seconds in stripped, purpose-built competition vehicles. The modern production car is faster than the old race car. In that single comparison is 60 years of continuous development, better understanding of combustion dynamics, better materials science, better manufacturing precision, better fuel chemistry. But underneath all of it, the same fundamental insight that Tom Hoover had in 1963. The shape of the combustion chamber matters. The size of the valves matters. The geometry of how air moves through an engine matters. Get that right, and everything else follows. The 426 Hemi started as the answer to a specific problem. How does a company with limited resources and a regulatory deadline beat Ford and General Motors in 1964? Tom Hoover and his team answered that question. Then they answered it again when NASCAR banned the engine. Then again when the drag racing authorities tried to contain it. Then again when the entire muscle car era collapsed and the world they'd built for changed completely. The engine spent most of its competitive life being told it wasn't allowed somewhere. It kept showing up anyway. Some technology is simply right. You can ban it, retire it, replace it with something cheaper and more compliant. But the physics that made it work don't change. The understanding it generated doesn't disappear. It just moves forward into the next engine, the next design, the next generation of engineers who learned what worked and built from there. The Hemi is why, the Hemi is how. 60 years later, that's still true. That's the story of the 426 Hemi. If you have one of these sitting in a garage somewhere, or if you think I missed something, because there are Hemi experts out there who know things I don't, drop it in the comments. And if you made it this far, go ahead and subscribe. We do this every week.